The Perfect Storm by Sebastian Junger, Part 5. Stimson has been awake for 48 hours now, much of it above deck. She's starting to get delirious. She slumps into a web seat in the back of the helicopter and looks out at the ocean and almost swallowed her up. I saw the most amazing thing. I saw Egypt, and I knew it was Egypt, she says. And I saw these clay animals. They were over green pastures, like the Garden of Eden. I could see these clay animals and also gorgeous live animals munching on grass. And I kept seeing cities that I recognized as being from the Middle East. While Stimson drifts in and out of hallucinations, the H-3 pounds home through a 70-knot headwind. It takes an hour and 40 minutes to get back to base. 3 miles off Martha's Vineyard, the crew look down and see another Coast Guard helicopter settling onto a desolate scrap of land called Norman's Island. A Florida longliner named Michelle Lane had run aground with a load of swordfish, and her crew had spent the night under an overturned life raft on the beach. An H-3 was dispatched from Air Station Cape Cod to take them off, and Hessel happens to fly by as they're landing. Hessel touches down at 4:40 at Air Station Cape Cod, and the other H-3 comes in a few minutes later. While landing at Norman's, as it turns out, the rotor wash flipped the raft over and knocked one of the fishermen unconscious. He was taken off in Stokes' litter. It's almost dark. Rain flashes down diagonally through the airfield floodlights, and scrub pine stretches away darkly for miles in every direction. The 6 survivors are ushered past the television cameras and led into a changing room upstairs. Stimson and Bylander pull off their survival suits, and Bylander curls up on a couch while Stimson goes back downstairs. The simple fact of being alive has her so wired she can hardly sit still. The Coast Guardsmen are gathered with the reporters in a small television room, and Stimson wanders in and finds Leonard sitting miserably on the floor, back to the wall. He's not saying a word. He didn't want to leave the boat. Simpson explains to a local reporter. It was his home, and everything he owned was on it. Dave Coolidge, the Falcon pilot, flew the previous night, walks up to Stimson and shakes her hand. Camera bulbs flash. "Boy, are we glad to see you two," he says. "It was a long night. I was afraid you weren't going to make it." Stimson says graciously, "When we heard you on the radio, we said, yes, we're going to make it. We're not just going to perish out here without anyone knowing." The reporters gradually drift off, and Leonard retires to an upstairs room. Stimson says and answers questions for the rescue crew, who are very interested in the relationship between Leonard and the 2 women. His reactions weren't quite what we expected, one of the guardsmen admits. Stimson explains that she and Bylander don't know Leonard very well, and met him through their boss. "Sue and I had been working several months without a break," she says. This trip was going to be our vacation." While they're talking, the phone rings. One of the Falcon pilots goes to answer it. "What time was that?" the pilot says, and everyone in the room stops talking. "How many were there? What location?" Without a word, the Coast Guardsmen get up and leave. A minute later, Stimson hears toilets flushing. When they come back, one of them asks the Falcon pilot where they went down. "South of Montauk," he says. The guardsmen zip up their fly suits and file out the door. A rescue helicopter has just ditched 50 miles offshore, and now 5 National Guardsmen are in the water swimming. Into the abyss. The Lord borrowed the heavens and came down. Thick darkness under his feet. The channels of sea were seen, and the foundations of the world were laid bare. Samuel 22. "I didn't know there was a problem. I just knew the Andrea Gale was supposed to be in any day," says Chris Cotter, Bobby Shatford's girlfriend. "I went to bed, and just before dawn, I had this dream. I'm on the boat, and it's real gray and ugly out, and rollin' and rockin', and I'm screaming, 'Bobby! Bobby!' There's no answer. I walk around the boat and go down into the fish hole and start digging. There's all this slime and weeds and slimy shit, and I'm hysterical and crazy and screaming for Bobby, and finally I get down, and there's one of his arms. I find that and grab him, and I know he's gone. And then the wake-up comes. It's the morning of October 30th. There's been no word from the Andrea Gale in over 36 hours. The storm is so tightly packed that a few people in Gloucester, only a few hundred miles from the storm's center, have any idea what's out there. Chris lies in bed for a while, trying to shake off the dream, and finally gets up and shuffles into the kitchen. Her apartment looks out across Ipswich Bay, and Christine can see the water itself, cold and gray as granite, piling up against the granite shores of Cape Ann. The air is warm, but an ill wind is backing around the compass, and Chris sits down at her kitchen table to watch it come. No one has said anything about the storm. There was nothing about it on the news. Chris smokes one cigarette after another, watching the weather come in off the sea, and she's still there when Susan Brown knocks on the door. Susan is Bob Brown's wife. She issues the paychecks for the Seagale Corporation, as Brown's company is called, and the week before she'd given Christine the wrong check by mistake. She'd given her Murph's check, which was larger than Bobby Shatford's, and now she's come back to rectify the mistake. Chris invites her in and immediately senses that something is wrong. Susan seems uncomfortable, glancing around and refusing to look Chris in the eyes. "Listen, Chris," Susan says finally, "I've got some bad news. I'm not sure how to say this. We don't seem to be able to raise the Andrea Gale." Chris sits there, stunned. She's still in the dream, still in the dark, slimy stink of the fish hole. And the news just confirms what she already knows. He's dead. Bobby Shatford is dead. Susan tells her they're still trying to get through and that their boat probably just lost her antennas, but Chris knows better. In her guts, she knows it's wrong. As soon as Susan leaves, Chris calls Mary Ann Shatford, Bobby's sister. Mary Ann tells her it's true. They can't raise Bobby's boat, and Chris drives down to the nest and rushes in through the big heavy door. It's only 10 in the morning, but already people are standing around with beers in their hands, red-eyed and shocked. Ethel is there, and Bobby's other sister, Susan, and his brother, Brian, and Preston, and dozens of fishermen. Nothing's sure yet. The boat could still be afloat, or the crew could be in a life raft, or drunk in some Newfoundland bar. But people are quiet. People are quietly assuming the worst. Chris starts drinking immediately. "People didn't want to give me the details, because I was totally out of my mind," she says. "Everybody was drunk because that's what we do. But the crisis made it even worse. Just drinking and drinking and crying and drinking. We just couldn't conceive that they were gone. It was in the paper and on the television. And this is my love, my friend, my man, my drinking partner. And it just couldn't be. I had pictures of what happened, images, Bobby and Sully and Murph, just bug-eyed, knowing that their final moment, looking at each other, and this jug of booze going around real fast because they're trying to numb themselves out. And then Bobby goes flying and Sully goes under. But what was the final moment? What was the final thing? The only person not at the crow's nest is Bob Brown. As owner of the boat, he may well not feel welcome there, but he's also got work to do. He's got a boat to find. There's a single sideband in his upstairs bedroom, and he's been calling on 2182 since early yesterday for both of his boats. Neither Billy Tyne nor Linda Greenlaw will come in. Oh boy, he thinks. At 9:30, after trying a few more times, Brown drives 20 miles south along Route 128 through the gray, rocky uplands of the North Shore. He parks at the King's Grant Inn in Danvers and walks into the conference room for the beginning of a 2-day New England Fisheries Management Council meeting. The wind is moving heavily through the treetops now, piling dead leaves up against the chain-link fence and spitting rain down from a steel sky. It's not a storm yet, but it's getting there. Brown takes a seat in the back room of the notebook, in the room, notebook in hand, and endures a long, interesting meeting. Someone brings up the fact that the Soviet Union has disintegrated into different countries, and U.S. fishing laws need to be changed accordingly. Another person cites a Boston Globe article that says cod, haddock, and flounder populations are so low that regulations are useless. The species are beyond saving. The National Marine Fisheries Service is not the sole institution with scientific knowledge on pelagic issues. A third person counters. The meeting finally adjourns after an hour of this, and Bob Brown gets up to talk with Gail Johnson, whose husband, Charlie, is out on the banks at that moment. Charlie owns the Seneca, which had put into Bay Bulls, Newfoundland, a few weeks earlier with a broken crankshaft. "Did you hear anything from your husband?" Brown asks. "Yeah, but I could hardly get him. He's east off the banks, and they've got bad weather out there." "I know they do," Brown says. "I know they do." Brown asks her to call him if Charlie hears anything about either of his boats. Then he hurries home. As soon as he arrives, he goes up to his bedroom and tries the single sideband again. And this time, thank God, Linda comes through. He can hear her only faintly through static. "I haven't been able to reach Billy in a couple of days," Linda shouts. "I'm worried about them." "Yeah, I'm worried too," says Brown. "Keep trying him. I'll check back." At 6 o'clock that night, the time he generally checks in with his boats, Brown tries one last time to raise the Andrea Gale. Not a sign. Linda Greenlaw hasn't been able to raise her, either, nor has anyone else in the fleet. At 6:15 on October 30th, 2 days to the hour after Billy Tyne was last heard from, Brown calls the Coast Guard in Boston and reports the vessel missing. "I'm afraid my boat's in trouble, and I fear the worst," he says. He adds that there have been no distress calls from her and no signals from the EPIRB. She has disappeared without a trace. In some senses, that's good news, because it may just mean she's lost her antennas. A distress call or EPIRB signal would be a different matter entirely. It would mean absolutely that something has gone wrong. Meanwhile, the news media has picked up on the story. Rumors are flying around Gloucester that the Allison has gone down along with the Andrea Gale, and that even the Hannah Bowden may be in trouble. A reporter from News Channel 5 calls Tommy Barry's wife, Kimberly, and asks her about the Allison. Kimberly answers that she talked to her husband the night before by single sideband, and that although she could barely hear him, he seemed to be fine. Channel 5 broadcasts that tidbit on the evening news, and suddenly every fisherman's wife on the East Coast is calling Kimberly Barry to ask if she has any news about the fleet. She just repeats that she talked to her husband on the 29th, and that she could barely hear him. As soon as the storms move offshore, the Weather Service stopped tracking them. She says the fishermen's wives are left hanging, and they panic. The wives always panic. In fact, the Eastern Fleet fared relatively well. They heaved to under heavy winds and a long-distance swell, and just waited out. Barry even contemplates fishing that night, but decides against it. No one can know where the storm is headed, and he doesn't want to get caught with his gear in the water. Barry keeps trying Billy every couple of hours throughout the night of the 28th and the following day, and by October 30th, he thinks Billy may have drifted out of range. He radios Linda and tells her that something is definitely wrong. Bob Brown should get a search going. Linda agrees. That night, after the boats have set their gear out, the captains get together on Channel 16 to set up a drift model for the Andrea Gale. They have an extremely low opinion of the Coast Guard's ability to read ocean currents, and so they pool their information as when tracking swordfish to try and figure out where a dead boat or a life raft would have gone. The water comes around the tail and wants to go up north, Barry says. By taking to boats at different places and putting them together, you can get a pretty detailed map of what the Gulf Stream is doing. Later on the night of the 30th, Bob Brown calls the Canadian Coast Guard in Halifax and says that the Andrea Gale is probably proceeding home along a route that cuts just south of Sable Island. He adds that Billy doesn't usually call during his 30-day trips. The Canadian cutter Edward Cornwallis, already at sea to help the Ancient Maru, starts calling for the Andrea Gale every quarter hour on Channel 16. "No joy on indicated frequency for contacting Andrea Gale," she reports later that morning. Halifax initiates a communications search as well on every frequency in the VHF spectrum, but also meets with failure. The fishing vessel Jenny and Doug reports hearing a faint Andrea Gale at 8294 kilohertz, and for the next 12 hours, Halifax tries that frequency but cannot raise her. Judith Reeves on the Ancient Maru thinks she hears someone with an English accent radioing the Andrea Gale that he's coming to their aid, but she can't make out the name of the vessel. She never hears the message again. A speed air radar search picks up an object that might possibly be the Andrea Gale, and Halifax tries to establish radio contact without success. At least half a dozen vessels around Sable Island the Edward Cornwallis, the Lady Hammond, the Sambro, the Jejero, the Yankee Clipper, the Melvin H. Baker, and the Mary Hitchens are conducting communication searches, but no one can raise them. They've fallen off the edge of the world. The Rescue Coordination Center in New York, meanwhile, is still trying to figure out exactly who is on the crew. Bob Brown doesn't know for sure. Often owners don't want to know, and even the various friends and family aren't 100% certain. Finally, the Coast Guard gets a call from a Florida fisherman named Doug Costco, who says he used to fish on the Andrea Gale and knows who the crew are. He runs down the list of crew as he knows it. Captain Billy Tyne from Gloucester. Bugsy Moran, also from Gloucester, but living in Florida. Dale Murphy from Cortez, Florida. Alfred Pierre, the only black guy on board from the Virgin Islands, but with family in Portland. Costco says that the fifth crew member was from the Hadit, Tyne's old boat, and that Merritt Seafoods in Pompano has his name. I was supposed to go on this trip, but I got off at the last moment, he says. I don't know why. I just got a funny feeling and stepped off. Costco gives the Coast Guardsman a phone number in Florida where he gets messages. He's offshore so much that he doesn't have his own phone. I think they may have gone short-handed. I hope they did, he says. I don't think Billy could have found anyone else so fast. It's wishful thinking. The morning Costco left, Billy called up Adam Randall and asked him if he wanted the job. Randall said yes, and Billy told him to get up to Gloucester as fast as possible. Randall showed up with his father-in-law, checked the boat over, and got spooked like Costco had. He walked off. So Billy called David Sullivan and happened to catch him at home. Sully reluctantly agreed to go and arrived at the State Fish Pier an hour later with his sea bag over his shoulder. The Andrea Gale went to sea with 6 men, a full crew. Costco doesn't know this, though, and all he knows is that last-minute decision 5 weeks ago probably saved his life. At about the same time that Costco confesses his good luck to the Coast Guard, Adam Randall settles onto the couch in his home in East Bridgewater, Massachusetts, to watch the evening news. It's a rain-lashed Halloween night, and Randall has just come back from taking his kids out trick-or-treating. His girlfriend Christine Hansen is with him. She's a pretty highly put-together blonde who drives a sports car and works for AT&T. The local news comes on, and Channel 5 reports a boat named the Andrea Gale missing somewhere east off Sable Island. Randall sits up in his seat. That was my boat, honey, he says. What? That's the boat I was supposed to go on. Remember, I went up to Gloucester. That's the boat, the Andrea Gale. Meanwhile, the worst crisis in history of the Air National Guard has been unfolding offshore. At 2:45 that afternoon, in the midst of the Santori rescue, District 1 Command Center in Boston receives a distress call from a Japanese sailor named Mikado Tomizawa, who was in a sailboat 250 miles off the New Jersey coast and starting to go down. The Coast Guard dispatches a C-130 and then alerts the Air National Guard, which operates a rescue group out of Suffolk Air Base in West Hampton Beach, Long Island. The Air Guard covers everything beyond maritime rescue, which is roughly defined by the fuel range of a Coast Guard H-3 helicopter. Beyond that, and Tomizawa was well beyond that, an Air Guard H-60 has to be used, which can be refueled in mid-flight. The H-60 flies in tandem with a C-130 tanker plane, and every few hours the pilot comes up behind the tanker and nudges a probe into one of the hoses trailing off each wing. It's a preposterously difficult maneuver in bad weather, but it allows an H-60 to stay airborne almost indefinitely. The Air Guard dispatcher on the intercom, minutes after the Mayday comes in, calling for a rescue, to gather at ODC, the Operations Dispatch Center. Dave Ruvola, the helicopter pilot, meets his co-pilot at the C-130 pilots in an adjacent room and spreads an aeronautical chart of the East Coast on the table. They study the weather forecasts and decide they will execute 4 mid-air refuelings, 1 immediately off the coast, 1 before the rescue attempt, and 2 on the way back. When the pilots are plotting their refueling points, a rescue swimmer named John Spillane and another swimmer named Rick Smith jog down the hallway to life support to pick up their survival gear. A crew cut supply clerk hands them a Mustang immersion suits, wetsuits, inflatable life vests, and mesh combat vests. The combat vests are worn by American airmen all over the world, and contain the minimum amount of gear: radio, flare kit, knife, strobe, matches, compass, needed to survive and in any environment. They put their gear in duffel bags and leave the building by a side door where they meet two pilots in a waiting truck. They get in, slam the door shut, and speed off across the base. A maintenance crew has already towed the helicopter out of the hangar and fueled it up, and flight engineer Jim Mioli is busy checking the records and inspecting the engine and rotors. It is a warm, windy day, and the scrub pine twisting and dancing along the edge of the tarmac, and seabirds sawing their way back and forth against a heavy sky. The pararescue jumpers load their gear in through the jump door and then take their seats at the rear of the aircraft, up against the fuel tanks. The pilots climb into the angled cockpit seats, go through their pre-flight checklists, and then fire the engines up. The rotors thud to life, losing the sag of their huge weight, and the helicopter shifts on its tires and is suddenly airborne, tilting nose down across the scrub. Rivola bears away to the southeast, and within minutes he has crossed the open ocean. The crew, looking down out of their spotters' windows, can see the surf thundering against Long Island. Up and down the coast, as far as they can see, the shore is bordered in white. In official terms, the attempt to help Tomizawa was categorized as an increased risk mission, meaning the weather conditions were extreme, and the survivor was in danger of perishing. The rescuers, therefore, were willing to accept a higher level of risk in order to save him. Among the actual crews, these missions are referred to as sporty, as in, boy, it sure was sporty out there last night. In general, sporty is good. It's what rescue is all about. An Air National Guard pararescue jumper, the military equivalent of Coast Guard rescue swimmers, might get half a dozen sporty rescues in a lifetime. These rescues are talked about, studied, and sometimes envied for years. Wartime, of course, is about as sporty as it gets, but it's rare and horrible circumstance that most pararescue jumpers don't experience. The Air National Guard is considered a state militia, meaning it's state-funded, but it's also a branch of the Air Force. As such, Grand Jumpers are interchangeable with Air Force jumpers. Between wars, the Air National Guard occupies itself rescuing civilians on the high seas, which means anything beyond the fuel range of a Coast Guard H-3 helicopter. That, depending on the weather, is around 200 miles offshore. The wartime mission of the Air National Guard is to save the life of an American fighting man, which generally means jumping behind enemy lines to extract down pilots. When the pilots go down at sea, the PJs, as they're known, jump with scuba gear. When they go down on glaciers, they jump with crampons and ice axes. When they go down in the jungle, they jump with 200 feet of tree-repelling line. There is, literally, nowhere on Earth a PJ can't go. I could climb Everest with the equipment in my locker, one of them said. All of the armed forces have some version of the pararescue jumper, but the Air National Guard jumpers and their Air Force equivalents are the only ones with an ongoing peacetime mission. Every time the space shuttle launches, an Air Guard C-130 from West Hampton Beach flies down to Florida to oversee the procedure. An Air Force rescue crew also flies to Africa to cover the rest of the shuttle's trajectory. Whenever a ship of any nationality finds itself in distress off North America, the Air National Guard can be called out. A Greek crewman say on a Liberian flagged freighter who has just fallen into a cargo hold could have guard jumpers parachute in to help him several hundred miles out at sea. An Air Guard base in Alaska that recovers a lot of Air Force trainees is permanently on alert, full cocked and ready to go. And two other bases in California and on Long Island are on standby. If a crisis develops offshore, a crew is put together from the men on base and whomever can be rounded up by telephone, typically by a helicopter crew, can be airborne in about an hour. It takes 18 months of full-time training to become a PJ, after which you owe the government 4 years of active service, which you're strongly encouraged to extend. There are about 350 PJs around the country, but developing them in such a lengthy and expensive process that the government is hard put to replace the ones who are lost every year. During the first 3 months of training, candidates are weeded out through sheer raw abuse. The dropout rate is often over 90%. In one drill, the team swims their normal 4,000-yard workout, and then the instructor tosses his whistle into the pool. 10 guys fight for it, and whoever manages to blow it at the surface gets to leave the pool. His workout is over for the day. The instructor throws the whistle in again, and the 9 remaining fight for it. This goes on until only one man's left, and he's kicked out of the PJ school. In a variation called water harassment, 2 swimmers share a snorkel while instructors basically try to drown them. If either man breaks the surface and takes a breath, he's out of school. There were times we cried, admits one PJ, but they've got to thin the ranks somehow. After pre-training, as it's called, the survivors enter a period known as the pipeline. Scuba school, jump school, free fall school, dunker tank school, survival school. The PJs learn how to parachute, climb mountains, survive in deserts, resist enemy interrogation, evade pursuit, navigate underwater at night. These schools are ruthless in their quest to weed people out. In dunker training, for example, the candidates are strapped into a simulated helicopter and plunged underwater. If they manage to escape, they're plunged in upside down. If they manage to escape, they're plunged in upside down and blindfolded. The guys who escape get to be PJs. The rest are rescued by divers waiting by the sides of the pool. These schools are for all branches of the military, and PJ candidates might find themselves training alongside Navy SEALs and Green Berets, who are simply trying to add, say, water survival to their repertoire of skills. If the Navy SEAL fails one of the courses, he just goes back to being a Navy SEAL. If a PJ fails, he's out of the entire program. For a period of 3 or 4 months, a PJ runs the risk daily of failing out of the school. And if he manages to make it through the pipeline, he still has almost another full year ahead of him. Paramedic training, hospital rotations, mountain climbing, desert survival, tree landings, more scuba school, tactical maneuvers, air operations. And because they have a wartime mission, the PJs also practice military maneuvers. They parachute into the ocean at night with inflatable speedboats. They parachute into the ocean at night with scuba gear and go straight into a dive. They deploy from a submarine by airlock and swim to a deserted coast. They train with shotguns, grenade launchers, M16s, and 6-barreled miniguns. Miniguns fire 6,000 rounds a minute and can cut down trees. Then finally, once they've mastered every conceivable battle scenario, they learn something called halo jumping. Halo stands for high altitude, low opening. It's used to drop PJs into hot areas where a more leisurely deployment would get them killed. In terms of violating the constraints of the physical world, halo jumping is one of the more outlandish things that human beings have ever done. The PJs jump from so high up, as high as 40,000 feet, that they need bottled oxygen to breathe. They leave the aircraft with 2 oxygen bottles strapped to their sides and a parachute on their back, a reserve chute on their chest, a full medical pack on their thighs, and an M16 on their harness. They're at the top of the troposphere, the layer where weather happens, and all they can hear is the scream of their own velocity. They're up so high they free fall for 2 or 3 minutes and pull their chutes at 1,000 feet or less. That way, they're almost impossible to kill. The H-60 flies through relative calm for the first half hour, and then Ruvola radios the tanker plane and says he's coming in for refueling. 140 pounds of pressure are needed to trigger the coupling mechanism in the feeder hose called the drogue, so the helicopter has to close in on the tanker plane at a fairly good rate of speed. Ruvola has the drogue on the first shot. It takes 700 pounds of fuel and continues down toward the southeast. Far below, the waves are getting smeared forward by the wind into an endless series of scalloped white crests. The crew is heading into the worst weather of their lives. The rules governing H-60 deployments state that international flights into known or forecast severe turbulence is prohibited. The weather report faxed by McGuthrie Air Base earlier that day called for moderate to severe turbulence, which was just enough semantic protection to allow Ruvola to launch. They were trained to save lives, and this is the kind of day that lives would need saving. An hour into the flight, Dave Ruvola comes in for the second refueling and pegs the drone after 4 attempts taking on 900 pounds of fuel. The 2 aircraft break apart and continue hammering toward Tomizawa. They are on scene 10 minutes later, and in almost complete dark. Spillane has spent the flight slowly putting his wetsuit on, trying not to sweat too much, trying not to dehydrate himself. Now he sits by the spotter's window, looking out at the storm. A Coast Guard C-130 circles at 500 feet, and the Air National Guard tanker circles several hundred feet above that. The lights poke feebly into the swarming darkness. Ruvola establishes a low hover aft of the sailboat and flips on his floods, which throw down a cone of light. From the belly of the craft, Spillane can't believe what he sees. A massive foam-laced swell rising and falling in the circle of light, some barely missing the belly of the helicopter. Twice he has to shout for altitude to keep the helicopter from getting slapped out of the sky. The wind is blowing so hard that the rotor wash, which normally falls directly below the helicopter, is 40 feet behind it. It lags the way it normally does when the helicopter is flying ahead at 80 knots. Despite the conditions, Spillane still assumes he and Rick Smith are going to deploy by sliding down a 3-inch thick fast rope into the sea. The question is what they will do then. The boat looks like it's moving too fast for a swimmer to catch, which means Tomizawa will have to be extracted from the water, like the Satori crew was. But that would put him at a whole other level of risk. There's a point at which sporty rescues become more dangerous than sinking boats. While Spillane considers Tomizawa's chances, flight engineer Jim Mioli gets on the intercom and says he has doubts about retrieving anyone from the water. The waves are rising too fast for the hoist controls to keep up, so there'll be too much slack around the basket at the crests of the waves. If a man were caught in a loop of cable and the wave dropped out from under him, he'd be cut in half. For the next 20 minutes, Ruvola keeps the helicopter in a hover above the sailboat while the crew peers out the jump door, discussing what to do. They finally agree that the boat looks pretty good in the water. She's riding high, relatively stable, and that any kind of rescue attempt will put Tomizawa in more danger than he's already in. He should stay with his boat. We're out of our league, boys. Ruvola finally says over the intercom, "We're not going to do this." Ruvola gets the C-130 pilot on the radio and tells him their decision, and the C-130 pilot relays it to the sailboat. Tomizawa, desperate, radios back that they don't have to deploy their swimmers at all. Just swing the basket over, and he'll rescue himself. "No, that's not the problem," Bouchard answers. "We don't mind going in the water. We just don't think a rescue is possible." Ruvola backs away, and the tanker plane drops 2 life rafts connected by 800 feet of line, in case Tomizawa's boat starts to founder, and then the 2 aircraft head back to base. Tomizawa was eventually picked up by a Romanian freighter. 10 minutes into the return flight, Ruvola lines up on the tanker for the 3rd time, hits the drogue immediately, and takes on 1,560 pounds of fuel. They'll need one more refueling in order to make sure. Spillane settles into the portside spotter's seat and stares down at the ocean 1,000 feet below. If Mioli hadn't spoken up, he and Rick Smith might be swimming around down there, trying to get back into the rescue basket. They'd have died. In conditions like these, so much water gets loaded into the air that swimmers drown simply trying to breathe. Months later, after the Air National Guard has put the pieces together, it will determine that gaps had developed in the web of resources designed to support an increased risk mission over water. At any given moment, someone had the necessary information for keeping Ruvola's helicopter airborne, but that information wasn't disseminated correctly. During the last hour of Ruvola's flight, several times a day, mission or no mission, McGuthrie Air Force Base in New Jersey faxes weather bulletins to Suffolk Air Base for their use in route planning. If Suffolk is planning a difficult mission, they might also call McGuire for a verbal update on flight routes, satellite information, etc. Once the mission is underway, one person, usually the tanker pilot, is responsible for obtaining and relaying weather information to all the pilots involved in the rescue. If he needs more information, he calls Suffolk and tells them to get it. Without the call, Suffolk doesn't actively pursue weather information. They are, in the words of the accident investigators, reactive rather than proactive in carrying out their duties. In Rivola's case, McGuire Air Force Base has real-time satellite information showing a massive rain band developing off Long Island between 7:30 and 8 p.m. Just as he's starting back for Suffolk, Suffolk never calls McGuire for an update, though because the tanker pilot never asks for one, and McGuire never volunteers the information because they don't know where there is an Air Guard helicopter. They don't know there is an Air Guard helicopter out there in the first place. Were Suffolk to call McGuire for an update, they'd learn that Rivola's route is blocked by severe weather, but that he can avoid it by flying 15 minutes to westward. As it is, the tanker pilot calls Suffolk for a weather update and gets a report of an 8,000-foot ceiling, 15-mile visibility, and low-level wind shear. He passes that information on to Rivola, who, having left the worst of the storm behind him, reasonably assumes that the conditions will only improve as he flies westward. All he has to do is refuel before hitting the wind shear that is being recorded around the airfield. Rivola, they all are wrong. The rain band is a swath of clouds, 50 miles wide, 80 miles long, and 10,000 feet thick. It is getting dragged into the low across the northwest quadrant of the storm. Winds are 75 knots, and the visibility is 0. Satellite imagery shows the rain band swinging across Rivola's flight path like a door slamming shut. At 7:55, Rivola radios the tanker pilot to confirm a fourth refueling, and the pilot rogers it. The refueling is scheduled for 5 minutes later, at precisely 8 o'clock. At 7:56, turbulence picks up a little, and at 7:58, it reaches moderate levels. "Let's get this thing done," Rivola radios the tanker pilot. At 7:59, he pulls the probe release, extends it forward, and moves into position for contact. And then it hits. Headwinds along the leading edge of the rain band are so strong that it feels as if the helicopter has been blown to a stop. Rivola has no idea what he's run into. All he knows is that he can barely control the aircraft. Flying has become much a question of physical strength as of finesse. He grips the collective with one hand, the joystick with the other, and leans forward to peer through the rain rattling off the windscreen. Flight manuals bounce around the cockpit, and his co-pilot starts throwing up in the seat next to him. Rivola lines up on the tanker and tries to hit the drogue, but the aircraft are moving around so wildly that it's like throwing darts down a gun barrel. Holding the target is pure dumb luck. In technical terms, Rivola's aircraft is doing things without inputs from the controls. In human terms, it's getting batted around the sky. Rivola tries as low as 300 feet along the ragged edges of the cloud, as he says, and as high as 4,500 feet, but he can't find clean air. The visibility is so bad that even with night vision goggles on, he can barely make out the wing lights of the tanker plane in front of him, and they are right on top of it. Several times they overshoot the drogue, and Spillane thinks they are going to take the plane's rudder off. Rivola has made 20 or 30 attempts on the drogue, a monstrous feat of concentration, when the tanker pilot radios that he has to shut down his number one engine. The oil pressure gauge is fluctuating wildly, and they are risking a burnout. The pilot starts in on the shutdown procedure, and suddenly the left-hand fuel hose retracts, shutting off the engine has disrupted the airflow around the wing, and the reeling mechanism has mistaken that for too much slack. It performs what is known as an uncommanded retraction. The pilot finishes shutting down the engine, brings Rivola back in, and then re-extends the hose. Rivola lines up on it and immediately sees that something is wrong. The drogue is shaped like a small parachute, and ordinarily it fills with air and holds the hose steady. Now it is just convulsing behind the tanker plane. It has been destroyed by 45 minutes of desperate refueling attempts. Rivola tells the tanker pilot that the left-hand drogue is shot and that they have to switch over to the other side. In these conditions, refueling from the right-hand drogue is a nightmarish, white-knuckled business because the helicopter probe also extends from the right-hand side of the cockpit. So the pilot has to come even tighter into the fuselage of the tanker to make contact. Rivola makes a run at the right-hand drogue, misses, comes in again, and misses again. The usual technique is to watch the tanker's wing flaps and anticipate where the drogue's going to go. But the visibility is so low that Rivola can't even see that far. He can barely see past the nose of his own helicopter. Rivola makes a couple of more runs at the drogue, and on his last attempt he comes in too fast, overshoots the wing, and by the time he's realigned himself, the tanker has disappeared. They've lost an entire C-130 in the clouds. They are at 4,000 feet in zero visibility with roughly 20 minutes of fuel left. After that, they will just fall out of the sky. Rivola can either keep trying to hit the drogue, or he can try to make it down to sea level while they still have fuel. "We're going to set up for a planned ditching," he tells his crew. "We're going to ditch while we still can." And then Dave Rivola drops the nose of the helicopter and starts racing his fuel gauge down to the sea. John Spillane, watching silently from the spotter's seat, is sure he's just heard his death sentence. "Throughout my career, I've always managed just barely to keep things in control," says Spillane. "But now, suddenly, the risk is becoming totally uncontrollable. We can't get fuel. We're going to end up in that roaring ocean, and we're not going to be in control anymore. And I know the chances of being rescued are practically zero. I've been on a lot of rescue missions, and I know they can hardly even find someone in these conditions, let alone recover them. We're some of the best in the business, best equipped and best trained. We couldn't do a rescue a little while earlier, and now we're in the same situation. It looks real bleak. It's not going to happen." While Rivola is flying blindly downward through the clouds, co-pilot Bouchard issues a mayday on Air National Guard emergency frequency, and then contacts the Temora. 15 minutes to the northeast, he tells them they are out of fuel and about to set up for a planned ditching. Captain Brudnicki orders the TAM's searchlights turned up to the sky so the helicopter can give them a bearing, but Bouchard says he can't see a thing. "Okay, just start heading towards us," the radio dispatcher on the TAM says. "We don't have time. We're going down right now." Bouchard replies. Jim McDougall, handling the radios at the ODC in Suffolk, receives simultaneously the ditching alert and a phone call from Spillane's wife, who wants to know where her husband is. She had no idea there was a problem and just happened to call at the wrong moment. McDougall is so panicked by the timing that he hangs up on her. At 9:08, a dispatcher at Coast Guard headquarters in Boston takes a call that an Air National Guard helicopter is going down and scrawls frantically in the incident log. "Hello, helicopter. And C-130 en route, Suffolk. Can't refuel Halo due visibility. May have to ditch. Stay airborne for how long? 20 to 25 minutes? Launch." He then notifies Cape Cod Air Base, where Karen Simpson is chatting with one of her rescue crews. The 5 airmen get up without a word, file into the bathroom, and then report for duty out on the tarmac. Rivola finally breaks out of the clouds at 9:28, only 200 feet above the ocean. He goes into a hover and immediately calls for the ditching checklist, which prepares the crew to abandon the aircraft. They have practiced this dozens of times in training, but things are happening so fast that the routines start to fall apart. Jim Mioli has trouble seeing in the dim cabin lighting used with night vision gear, so he can't locate the handle of the 9-man air life raft. By the time he finds it, he doesn't have time to put on his Mustang survival suit. Rivola calls 3 times for Mioli to read him the ditching checklist, but Mioli is too busy to answer him, so Rivola has to go through it by memory. One of the most important things on the list is for the pilot to reach down and eject his door, but Rivola is working too hard to remove his hands from the controls. In military terminology, he has to become task-saturated, and the door stays on. While Rivola is trying to hold the aircraft in a hover, the PJs scramble to put together the survival gear. Spillane slings a canteen over his shoulders and clips a 1-man life raft to the strap. Jim Mioli, who finally manages to extract the 9-man raft, pushes it to the edges of the jump door and waits for the order to deploy. Rick Smith, draped in survival gear, squats at the edge of the other jump door and looks over the side. Below is an ocean ravaged by wind, so ravaged by wind that they can't even tell the difference between the waves and the troughs. For all they know, they are jumping 300 feet. As horrible as that is, though, the idea of staying where they are is even worse. The helicopter is going to drop into the ocean at any moment, and no one on the crew wants to be anywhere nearby when it does. Only Dave Ruvola will stay on board. As pilot, it's his job to make sure the aircraft doesn't fall on the rest of the crew. The chances of his escaping with his door still in place are negligible, but that is besides the point. The ditching checklist calls for a certain procedure, and a procedure that ensures the survival of the greatest number of crew. That Mioli neglects to put on his survival suit also. In some ways, suicidal, but he has no choice. His duty is to oversee a safe bailout, and if he stops to put his survival suit on, the 9-man raft won't be ready for deployment. He jumps without his suit. At 9:30, the number 1 engine flames out. Spillane can hear the turbine wind down. They've been in a low hover for less than a minute. Ruvola calls out on the intercom, "The number 1's out! Bail out! Bail out!" The number 2 is running on fumes. In theory, they should flame out at the same time. This is it. They're going down. Mioli shoves the life raft out the right-hand door and watches it fall, in his words, into the abyss. They are so high up that he doesn't even see it hit the water, and he can't bring himself to jump after it. Without telling anyone, he decides to take his chances in the helicopter. Ditching protocol calls for co-pilot Bouchard to remain on board as well, but Ruvola orders him out because he decides Bouchard's chances of survival will be higher if he jumps. Bouchard pulls his door release lever, but the door doesn't pop off the fuselage, so he just holds it open with one hand and steps out onto the footboard. He looks back at the radar altimeter, which is fluctuating between 10 feet and 80, and realizes that the timing of his jump will mean the difference between life and death. Ruvola repeats his order to bail out, and Bouchard unplugs the intercom wires from his flight helmet and flips his night vision goggles down. Now he can watch the waves rolling underneath him in the dim green light of enhanced vision. He spots a huge crest, takes a breath, and jumps. Spillane, meanwhile, is grabbing some last-minute gear. "I wasn't terrified. I was scared," he says. 40 minutes before, I'd been more scared, thinking about the possibilities, but at the end, I was totally committed. The pilot had made the decision to ditch, and it was a great decision. How many pilots might have just used up the last 20 minutes of fuel trying to hit the drogue? Then you'd fall out of the sky, and everyone would die. The helicopter is strangely quiet, without the number 1 engine. The ocean below them, in the words of another pilot, looks like a lunar landscape, cratered and gouged and deformed by wind. Spillane spots Rick Smith at the starboard door, poises to jump, and moves toward him. "I'm convinced he was sizing up the waves," Spillane says. I wanted desperately to stick together with him. I just had time to sit down, put my arm around his shoulders, and he went. We didn't have time to say anything. You want to say goodbye. You want to do a lot of things. But there's no time for that. Rick went, and split second later, I did. According to people who have survived long falls, the acceleration of gravity is so heart-stoppingly fast that it's more like getting shot downward out of a cannon. A body accelerates roughly 20 miles an hour for every second it's in the air. After 1 second, it's falling 20 miles an hour. After 2 seconds, 40 miles an hour, and so on, up to 130. At that point, the wind resistance is equal to the force of gravity, and the body is said to have reached terminal velocity. Spillane falls probably 60 or 70 feet, 2.5 seconds of acceleration. He plunges through darkness without any idea of where the water is or when he's going to hit. He has a dim memory of letting go of one of his one-man raft and of his body losing position. And he thinks, my God, what a long way down. And then everything goes blank. John Spillane has the sort of handsome regular features that one might expect in a Hollywood actor playing for pararescueman, playing John Spillane, in fact. His eyes are stone blue without a trace of hardness or indifference. His hair is short and touched with gray. He comes across as friendly, unguarded, and completely sure of himself. He has a quick smile and an offhand way of talking that seems to progress from detail to detail, angle to angle, until there's nothing more to say on a topic. His humor is delivered casually, almost as an afterthought, and seems to surprise even himself. He's of average height, average build, and once ran 40 miles for the hell of it. He seems to be a man who has long since lost the need to prove things to anyone. Spillane grew up in New York City and joined the Air Force at 17. He trained as a combat diver, infiltrating positions, securing beaches, rescuing other combat divers, and then left at 21 to join the Air National Guard. He guard bombed around the world for a year, returning to Rockaway Beach to lifeguard in the summer, and then signed up for PJ school. After several years of reserve duty, he quit, went through the police academy, and became a scuba diver for the New York City Police Department. For 3 years, he pulled bodies out of submerged cars and mucked guns out of the East River, and finally decided to go back to school before his GI Bill ran out. He started out majoring in geology. I wanted to go stomp mountaintops for a while, but he fell in love instead and ended up moving out to Suffolk to work full-time for the Guard. That was in 1989. He was 32, one of the most widely experienced PJs in the country. When John Spillane hits the Atlantic Ocean, he is going about 50 miles an hour. Water is the only element that offers more resistance the harder you hit it. At 50 miles an hour, it might as well be concrete. Spillane fractures 3 bones in his right arm, 1 bone in his left leg, 4 ribs in his chest, ruptures a kidney, and bruises his pancreas. The flippers, the one-man raft, and the canteen are all torn off his body. Only the mask, which he wore backward with the strap in his mouth, stays on as it's supposed to. Spillane doesn't remember the moment of impact, and he doesn't remember the moment he first realized he was in the water. His memory goes from falling to swimming, with nothing in between. When he understands that he is swimming, that is all he understands. He doesn't know who he is, why he is there, or how he got there. He has no history and no future. He's just a consciousness at night in the middle of the sea. When Spillane treats injured seamen offshore, one of the first things he evaluates is their degree of consciousness. The highest level, known as alert and oriented times 4, describes almost everyone in an everyday situation. They know who they are, where they are, and what time it is, and what's just happened. If someone suffers a blow to the head, the first thing they lose is recent events, alert and oriented times 3, and the last thing they lose is their identity. A person who has lost all 4 levels of consciousness, right down to their identity, is said to be alert and oriented times 0. When John Spillane wakes up in the water, he is alert and oriented times 0. His understanding of the world is reduced to the fact that he exists, nothing more. Almost simultaneously, he understands that he is in excruciating pain. For a long time, that is all he knows, until he sees the life raft. Spillane may be alert and oriented times 0, but he knows to swim for a life raft when he sees one. It has been pushed out by Jim Mioli, the flight engineer, and has inflated automatically when it hits the water. Now it is scudding along the wave crests, the sea anchors barely holding it down in the 70-knot wind. I lined up on it, intercepted it, and hung off the side, says Spillane. I knew I was in the ocean, in a desperate situation, and I was hurt. I didn't know anything else. It was while I was hanging onto the raft that it all started coming back to me. We were on a mission. We ran out of fuel. I bailed out. I'm not alone. While Spillane is hanging off the raft, a gust of wind catches it and flips it over. One moment, Spillane is in the water trying to figure out who he is. The next moment, he is high and dry. Instantly, he feels better. He is lying on the wobbly nylon floor, evaluating the stabbing pain in his chest. He thinks he's punctured his lungs. When he hears people shouting in the distance, he kneels and points his diver's light in their direction. And just as he is wondering how to help them, whoever they are, the storm gods flip the raft over again. Spillane is dumped back into the sea. He clings to the safety line, gasping and throwing up seawater, and almost immediately the wind flips the raft over a third time. He has now gone 1.5 revolutions. Spillane is back inside, lying spread eagle on the floor, when the raft is flipped over a fourth and final time. Spillane is tossed back into the ocean water, this time clinging to a rubberized nylon bag that later turns out to contain half a dozen wool blankets. It floats, and Spillane hangs off of it and watches the raft go cartwheeling off across the wave crests. He is left alone and dying on the sea. After I lost contact with the raft, I was by myself, and I realized my only chance of survival was to make it until the storm subsided, he says. There was no way they could pick us up. I just ditched a perfectly good helicopter, and I knew our guys would be the ones to come out and get us if they could, but they couldn't. They couldn't refuel. So I'm contemplating this, and I know I cannot make it through the storm. They might have somebody on scene when the light breaks, but I'm not going to make it that long. I'm dying inside. For the first time since the ordeal began, Spillane has the time to contemplate his own death. He isn't panicked so much as saddened by the idea. His wife is 5 months pregnant with their first child, and he's been home very little recently. He was in paramedic school and in training for the New York City Marathon. He wishes that he'd spent more time at home. He wishes incredibly that he'd cut the grass one more time before winter. He wishes that there was someone who could tell his wife and family what happened in the end. It bothers him that Dave Ruvola probably died taking the helicopter in. It bothers him that they're all going to die for lack of 500 pounds of jet fuel. The shame of it all, he thinks. We have this $8 million helicopter. Nothing's wrong with it. Nobody's shooting at us. We're just out of fuel. Spillane has regained his full senses by this point, and the circumstances he finds himself in are nightmarish beyond words. It's so dark that he can't see his hand in front of his face. The waves just rumble down on him out of nowhere and bury him for a minute at a time. The wind is so strong it doesn't blow the water so much as fling it. There is no way to keep it out of his stomach. Every few minutes he has to retch it back up. Spillane has lost his one-man life raft. The ribs are broken, and every breath feels like he is being run through with a hot fire poker. He is crying out in pain, and dawn isn't for another 8 hours. And after an hour of making his farewells and trying to keep the water out of his stomach, Spillane spots two strobes in the distance. The Mustang suits have all have strobe lights on them, and it is the first real evidence that someone else has survived the ditching. Spillane's immediate reaction is to swim toward them, but he stops himself. There's no way he's going to live out the night. He knows, so he might as well just die on his own. That way he won't inflict his suffering on anyone else. I didn't want them to see me go, he says. I didn't want them to see me in pain. It's the same with the marathons. Don't talk to me. Let me just suffer through this by myself. What finally drove me to them was survival training. It emphasizes strength in numbers, and I know that if I'm with them, I'll try harder not to die. But I couldn't let them see me in pain. I told myself I couldn't let them down. Believing that their chances will be slightly less negligible in a group, Spillane slowly makes his way toward the lights. He is buoyed up by his life vest and wetsuit, swimming with his broken arm stretched out in front of him, gripping the blanket bag. It takes a long time, and the effort exhausts him, but he can see the lights slowly getting closer. They disappear in the wave troughs, appear on the crests, and then disappear again. Finally, after a couple of hours of swimming, he gets close enough to shout and then to make out their faces. It's Dave Ruvola and Jim Mioli, roped together with a parachute cord. Ruvola seems fine, but Mioli is nearly incoherent with hypothermia. He only has his Nomex flight suit on, and the chances of him lasting until dawn are even lower than Spillane's. Ruvola had escaped the helicopter unscathed, but barely. He knew that the rotors would tear him and the helicopter apart if they hit the water at full speed, so he moved the aircraft away from his men, waited for the number 2 engine to flame out, and then performed what is known as hovering auto-rotation. As the helicopter fell, its dead rotors started to spin, and Ruvola used that energy to slow the aircraft down, like downshifting a car on a hill. Hovering auto-rotation is a way of dissipating the force of gravity by feeding it back through the engine. By the time the helicopter hit the water, it had slowed to a manageable speed, and all the torque had been bled out of the rotors. They just smacked the face of an oncoming wave and stopped. Ruvola found himself in a classic training situation, only it was real life. He had to escape from a flooded helicopter, upside down, in complete darkness. He was a former PJ, though, and a marathon swimmer, so being underwater was something he was used to. The first thing he did was reach for his Heeds bottle and a 3-minute air supply strapped to his left leg, but it had been ripped loose during the ditching. All he had was the air in his lungs. He reached up, pulled the quick release of his safety belt, and it was then that he realized he'd never kicked the exit door out. He was supposed to do that so that it wouldn't get jammed shut on impact, trapping him inside. He found the door handle, turned it, and pushed. To his amazement, the door fell open. Rivola kicked his way out from under the fuselage, tripped the CO2 cartridge on his life vest, and shot 10 or 15 feet to the surface. He popped up into a world of shrieking darkness and landsliding seas. At one point, the crest of a wave drove him so far under the surface that the pressure change damaged his inner ear. Rivola started yelling for the other crew members, and a few minutes later, flight engineer Mioli, who'd also managed to escape the sinking helicopter, answered him in the darkness. They started swimming towards each other, and after 5 or 10 minutes, Rivola got close enough to grab Mioli by his survival vest. He took the hood off of his survival suit, put it on Mioli's head, and then tied their two bodies together with parachute cord. They'd been in the water for a couple of hours when Spillane finally struggles up, face locked with pain. The first thing Rivola sees is a giant light of a face mask and thinks maybe it's a Navy SEAL who has airlocked out of a U.S. submarine and is coming to save them. It isn't. Spillane swims up and grabs a strap on Rivola's flotation vest and clamps his other arm around the blanket bag. "What's that?" Rivola screams. "I don't know. I'll open it tomorrow." Spillane yells back. "Open it now," Rivola answers. Spillane is in too much pain to argue about it, so he opens the bag and watches several dark shapes, the blankets, go snapping off downwind. He tosses the bag aside and settles down to face the next few hours as best he can. One can tell by the very handwriting in the District 1 incident log that the dispatcher, in this case, a Coast Guardsman named Gill, can't quite believe what he's writing down. The words are large and sloppy, and salted with exclamation points. At one point, he jots down apropos of nothing. "They're not alone out there," as if to reassure himself that things will turn out all right. That entry comes at 9:30, seconds after Bouchard calls in the first engine loss. 5 minutes later, Gill writes down 3951 north, 7200 west, ditching here, 5 POB, people on board. 7 minutes after that, the tanker plane, which will circle the area until their fuel runs low, reports hearing an EPIRB signal for 15 seconds, then nothing. From Gill's notes, 9:30, Tamaroa in area, launched 865. 9:48, Cape Cod, 60. 9:53, CAA, Commander of Atlantic Area, IBRFD. Anything you want. Navy ship would be great. We'll look. Within minutes of the ditching, rescue assets from Florida to Massachusetts are being readied for deployment. The response is massive and nearly instantaneous. At 9:48, 13 minutes into it, Air Station Cape Cod launches a Falcon jet and an H-3 helicopter. Half an hour later, a Navy P-3 jet at Brunswick Naval Air Station is requested and readied. The P-3 is infrared equipped to detect heat-emitting objects, like people. The Tamaroa has diverted before the helicopter has even gone down. At 10:23, Boston requests a second Coast Guard cutter. The Spencer. They even consider diverting an aircraft carrier. The survivors are drifting fast in mountainous seas, and the chances of spotting them are terrible. Helicopters will have minimal time on scene because they can't refuel. It's unlikely conditions would permit a hoist rescue anyway, and there's no way to determine if the guardsman radios are even working. That leaves the Tamaroa to do the job, but she wasn't even able to save the Satori crew during less severe conditions. The storm is barreling westward, straight toward the ditch point, and wave heights are climbing past anything ever recorded in the area. If things look bad for Rivola's crew, they don't look much better for the people trying to rescue them. It's not inconceivable that another helicopter will have to ditch during the rescue effort, or that Coast Guardsmen will get washed off the Tamaroa. For that matter, the Tamaroa herself, at 205 feet, is not necessarily immune to disaster. One freak wave could roll her over and put 80 men in the water. Half a dozen aircraft, 2 ships, and 200 rescuers are heading for 39 north, 72 west. The more men out there, the higher the chances are of someone else getting into trouble. A succession of disasters could draw the rescue assets of the entire east coast of the United States out to sea. A Falcon jet out of Air Station Cape Cod is the first aircraft on scene. It arrives 90 minutes after the ditching, and the pilot sets up what is known as an expanding square search. He moves slightly down sea for the last known position, the splash point, and starts flying ever-increasing squares until he has covered an area 10 miles across. He flies at 200 feet just below the cloud cover, and estimates the probability of spotting the survivors to be 1 in 3. He turns up nothing. Around 11:30, he expands the search to a 20-mile square and starts all over again, slowly working his way southwest with the direction of drift. The infrared equipped P-3 is getting ready to launch from Brunswick, and a Coast Guard helicopter is pounding its way southward from Cape Cod. And then, 10 minutes into the second square, he picks up something, a weak signal on 243 megahertz. That's a frequency coded to Air National Guard radios. It means that at least one of the airmen is still alive. The Falcon's pilot homes in on the signal and tracks it to a position about 20 miles down sea of the splash point. Whoever it is, they're drifting fast. The pilot comes in low, scanning the sea with night vision goggles, and finally spots a lone strobe flashing below them in the darkness. It's appearing and disappearing behind the huge swell. Moments later, he spots 3 more strobes half a mile away. All but one of the crew are accounted for. The pilot circles, flashing his lights, and then radios his position in to District 1. An H-3 helicopter equipped with a hoist and rescue swimmer is only 20 minutes away. The whole ordeal could be over in less than an hour. The Falcon circles the strobes until the H-3 arrives, and then heads back to base with a rapidly falling fuel gauge. The H-3 is a huge machine, similar to the combat helicopters used in Vietnam, and has spare fuel tanks installed inside the cabin. It can't refuel mid-flight, but it can stay airborne for 4 or 5 hours. The pilot, Ed DeWitt, tries to establish a 40-foot hover, but wind shear keeps spiking him downward. The ocean is a ragged white expanse in his searchlights, and there are no visual reference points to work off of. At one point, he turns downwind and almost gets driven into the sea. DeWitt edges his helicopter to within 100 yards of 3 men and tells his flight engineer to drop the rescue basket. There's no way he's putting his swimmer in the water, but these are experienced rescuemen, and they may be able to extract themselves. It's either that or wait for the storm to calm down. The flight engineer pays out the cable and watches in alarm as the basket is blown straight back toward the tail rotors. It finally reaches the water, swept backward at an angle of 45 degrees, and DeWitt tries to hold a steady hover long enough for the swimmers to reach the basket. He tries for almost an hour, but the waves are so huge that the basket doesn't spend more than a few seconds on each crest before dropping to the end of its cable. Even if the men could get themselves into the basket, a shear pin in the hoist mechanism is designed to fail with loads over 600 pounds, and 3 men, waterlogged clothing, would definitely push that limit. The entire assembly, cable, basket, everything, would let go into the sea. DeWitt finally gives up trying to save the airmen and goes back to a hover at 200 feet. In the distance, he can see the Tamaroa, searchlights pointed straight up, plunging through the storm. He vectors her in toward the position of the lone strobe in the distance, Graham Bashore, and then drops a flare by the others and starts back for Suffolk. He's only minutes away from Bingo, the point at which an aircraft doesn't have enough fuel to make it back to shore. 200 feet below, John Spillane watches his last hope clatter away toward the north. He hadn't expected to get rescued, but still, it's hard to watch. The only benefit he can see is that his family will know for sure that he died. That might spare them weeks of false hope. In the distance, Spillane can see lights rising and falling in the darkness. He assumes it's a Falcon jet looking for the other airmen, but its lights are moving strangely. It's not moving like an aircraft, it's moving like a ship. The Tamaroa has taken 4 hours to cover 15 miles to the splash point. Her screws are turning for 12 knots and making 3. Commander Brudnicki doesn't know how strong the wind is because it rips the anemometer off the mast, but the pilot, Ed DeWitt, reports that his airspeed indicator hit 87 knots, 100 miles an hour, while he was in a stationary hover. The Tamaroa's course to the downed airmen puts them in beam C, which starts to roll the ship through an arc of 110 degrees. At that angle, bulkheads are easier to walk on than floors. In the wheelhouse, Commander Brudnicki is surprised to find himself looking up at the crest of the waves. And when he orders full rudder and full bell, it takes 30 or 40 seconds to see any effect at all. Later, after stepping off the ship, he says, "I certainly hope that was the high point of my career." The first airman they spot is Graham Bouchard, swimming alone and relatively unencumbered, a half mile from the other 3. He's in a Mustang survival suit and has a pen gun flare and the only functional radio beacon of the entire crew. Brudnicki orders the operations officer, Lieutenant Christopher Furtney, to maneuver the Tamaroa upsea of Bouchard and then drift down on him. Large objects drift faster than small ones, and if the ship is upward of Bouchard, the waves won't smash him against the hull. The gunner's mate starts firing flares off from cannons on the flying bridge, and a detail of seamen crouch in the bow with throwing ropes, waiting for their chance. They can hardly keep their feet in the wind. The engines come to a full stop, and the Tamaroa wallows beam to in the huge seas. It's dangerous position to be in. The Tamaroa loses her righting arm at 72 degrees, and she's already heeling to 55. Drifting down on swimmers, it is standard rescue procedure, but the seas are so violent that Bouchard keeps getting flung out of reach. There are times when he's 30 feet higher than the men trying to rescue him. The crew in the bow can't get a throwing rope anywhere near him, and Brudnicki won't order his rescue swimmer overboard because he's afraid he won't get him back. The men on deck finally realize that if the boat's not going to Bouchard, Bouchard is going to have to swim. Bouchard is going to have to go to it. "Swim!" they scream over the rail. "Swim!" Bouchard rips off his gloves and hood and starts swimming for his life. He swims as hard as he can. He swims until his arms give out. He claws his way up to the ship, gets swept around the bow, struggles back within reach of it, and again finally catches hold of a cargo net that the crew had dropped over the side. The net looks like a huge rope ladder and is held by 6 or 7 men at the rail. Bouchard twists his hands into the mesh and slowly gets hauled up the hull. One good wave at the wrong moment could take them all out. The deck crew men land Bouchard like a big fish and carry him into the deck house. He's dry heaving seawater and can barely stand. His core temperature has dropped to 94 degrees. He's been in the water for 4 hours and 25 minutes. Another few hours and he may not have been able to cling to the net. It's taken half an hour to get one man on board, and they have 4 more to go, one of whom hasn't even been sighted. Yet, it's not looking good. Brudnicki is also starting to have misgivings about putting his men on deck. The larger waves are sweeping the bow and completely burying the crew. They keep having to do head counts to make sure no one has been swept overboard. It was the hardest decision I've ever had to make, to put my people out there and rescue that crew, Brudnicki says, because I knew there was a chance I could lose some of my men. If I decided not to do the rescue, no one back home would have said a thing. They knew it was almost impossible, but can you really make a conscious decision to say, I'm just going to watch those people in the water die. Brudnicki decides to continue the rescue. 20 minutes later, he has the Tamaroa in a beam C 100 yards upwind of the 3 guardsmen. Crew members are lighting off flares and aiming searchlights, and the chief quartermaster is on the flying bridge, radioing Furtney when to fire the ship's engine. Not only do they have to maneuver the drift, but they have to time the roll of the ship so the gunwale rides down toward the waterline while the men in the water grab for the net. As it is, the gunwales are riding from water level to 20 feet in the air virtually everywhere. Spillane is injured, Mioli is incoherent, and Rivola is helping to support them both. There's no way they'll be able to swim like Bouchard. Spillane watches the ship heaving through the breaking seas, and for the life of him, he can't imagine how they're going to do this. As far as he's concerned, a perfectly likely outcome is for all three of them to drown within sight of the ship, because a pickup is impossible. My muscles were getting rigid. I was in great pain, he says. The Tam pulled up in front of us and turned broadsides to the waves, and I couldn't believe they did that. They were putting themselves in terrible risk. We could hear them all screaming on the deck. We could see the chemical lights coming at us, tied to the ends of ropes. The ropes are difficult to catch, so the deck crew throw the cargo net over the side. Lieutenant Furtney again tries to ease his ship over to the swimmers, but the vessel is 1,600 tons and almost impossible to control. Finally, on the third attempt, they snag the net. Their muscles are cramping with cold, and Jim Mioli is about to start a final slide into hypothermia. The men on deck give a terrific heave. They're pulling up 600 pounds dead weight, and at that same time, a large wave drops out from underneath the swimmers. They're exhausted and desperate, and the net is wrenched out of their hands. The next thing Spillane knows, he's underwater. He fights his way to the surface just as the boat rolls inward toward them, and he grabs the net again. This is it. If he can't do it now, he dies. The deck crew heaves again, and Spillane feels himself getting pulled up the steel hull. He climbs up a little higher, feels hands grabbing him, and the next thing he knows, he's being pulled over the gunwale onto the deck. He's in such pain he cannot stand. The men pin him against the bulkhead, cut off his survival suit, and then carry him inside. Staggering with the roll of the ship, Spillane can't see Rivola and Mioli. They haven't managed to get back onto the net. The waves wash the 2 men down the hull toward the ship's stern, where the 12-foot screw is digging out a cauldron of boiling water. Furtney shuts the engines down, and the 2 men get carried out around the stern, and then up the port side of the ship. Rivola catches the net for the second time and gets one hand into the mesh. He clamps the other one around Mioli and screams into his face, "You gotta do this, Jim! There aren't too many second chances in life. This is gonna take everything you got." Mioli nods and wraps his hands into the mesh. Rivola gets a foothold as well as a handhold and grips with all the strength in his cramping muscles. The 2 men get dragged upward, penduluming in and out with the roll of the ship, until the deck crew at the rail can reach them. They grab Rivola and Mioli by the hair, the Mustang suit, the combat vest, anything they can get their hands on, and pull them over the steel rail. Like Spillane, they're retching seawater and can barely stand. Jim Mioli has been in 60-degree water for over 5 hours and is severely hypothermic. His core temperature is 90.4, 8 degrees below normal. Another couple of hours and he'd be dead. The 2 airmen are carried inside, their clothing cut off, and they're laid in bunks. Spillane is taken to the executive officer's quarters and given an IV and catheter and examined by the ship's paramedic. His blood pressure is 140/90. His pulse is 100, and he's running a slight fever. Eyes pearled, abdomen and chest tenderness. Pain to quadricep in the paramedic radios. SAR Ops. Search and Rescue Operations, Boston. Fractured wrist, possibly ribs. Suspect internal injury. Taking Tylenol 3 and seasick patch. Boston relays the information to the Air National Guard flight surgeon, who says he's worried about the internal bleeding, and tells them to watch the abdomen carefully. If it gets more and more tender to the touch, he's bleeding inside and has to be evacuated by helicopter. Spillane thinks about dangling in a rescue litter over the ocean and says he'd rather not. At daybreak, the executive officer comes in to shave and change his clothes, and Spillane apologizes for bleeding and vomiting all over his bed. "Hey, whatever it takes," the officer says. He opens the porthole hatch, and Spillane looks out at the howling gray sky and the ravaged ocean. "Could you close that?" he says. "I can't take it." The crew, unshaven and exhausted, after 36 hours on deck, are staggering around the ship like drunks, and the mission's far from over. Rick Smith is still out there. He's one of the most highly trained pararescue jumpers in the country, and there's no question in anyone's mind that he's alive. They just have to find him. PJ, wearing black quarter-inch wetsuit, went outdoor with one-man life raft and spray sheet, 2 12-ounce cans of water, mirror, flare kit, granola bar, and whistle. The Coast Guard dispatcher in Boston records, "Man is in great shape, can last quite a while, 5 to 7 days. A total of 9 aircraft are slated for the search, including an E-2 surveillance plane to coordinate the air traffic on scene. Jim Dougherty, a PJ, who went through training with Smith and Spillane, throws a tin of Skull chewing tobacco in his gear to give Smith when they find him. The guy's so good, guardsmen are saying he's just going to come through the front door at Suffolk Air Force Base, wondering where the hell we all were." The dreams of the dead. All collapsed, and the great shroud of the sea rolled on as it had 5,000 years ago. Herman Melville, Moby Dick. By the time word has spread throughout Gloucester that the fleet's in trouble, the storm has retrograded within 350 miles of Cape Cod and developed such steep pressure gradient that an eye starts to form. Satellite photos show a cyclonic swirl 2,000 miles wide off the east coast. The southern edge reaches Jamaica, and the northern edge reaches the coast of Labrador. In all 750,000 square miles of ocean are experiencing gale force conditions, and an area 3 or 4 times that is indirectly involved in the storm. On the satellite photos, moist air flowing into the low looks like a swirl of cream in a cup of black coffee. Thick strands of white cloud cover and dark Arctic air circle 1.5 times around the low before making it into the center. The low grinds steadily toward the coast, intensifying as it goes, and by the morning of October 31st, it has stalled 200 miles south of Montauk, Long Island. The worst winds, the northeast quadrant, are getting dragged straight across Gloucester Harbor and Massachusetts Bay. So sudden and violent are the storm's first caresses of the coast that a tinge of hysteria creeps into the local weather bulletins. Unconfirmed reports of 2 houses collapsing have been received from the Gloucester area. Other Massachusetts locations under the gun. Seas of 25 to 45 feet have occurred today from Georgia Spank east. The dangerous storm associated with high seas is moving southeast, closer to New England. The first coastal flood warnings are issued at 3:15 a.m. on the 29th, based mainly on reports from Nantucket of sustained winds of up to 45 knots. Predictions from the Weather Service's computers are systematically exceeding almost all atmospheric models for the area, and high tides are predicted to be 2 to 3 feet above normal. These predictions, as it turns out, will be way too low. The warnings go out via satellite uplink along something called the NOAA Weather Wire, which feeds into local media and emergency services. By dawn, radio and television announcers are informing the public about the oncoming storm, and the State Emergency Management Agency is contacting local authorities along the coast to make sure they take precautions. The EMA is based in Framingham, Massachusetts, outside of Boston, and has direct lines to Governor Weld's office, the National Guard, the State Police Barracks, and the National Weather Service. Any threat to public health is routed through the EMA. If local communities don't have the resources to cope, state agencies step in. If state agencies can't handle it, the federal government gets called. The EMA is set up to handle everything from severe thunderstorms to nuclear war. October 31st on shore is deceptively calm and mild. Oak leaves skitter down the street, and the midday sun has a thin warmth to it that people won't feel again until spring. The only sign that something is amiss along the coast, where huge gray swells start to roll in, that can be heard miles inland. Swells are the outriders of sea weather. If they keep getting bigger, the weather is approaching. The Gloucester Police Department blocks access to the shore, but people go anyway, parking their cars half a mile away and walking through the rising wind and rain to hilltops where they can look out to sea. They are greeted by an ocean that has been wholly transformed. Swells march shoreward from the horizon in great even bands, their white crests streaming sideways in the wind, and their ranks breaking, reforming, and breaking again as they close in on Cape Ann. In the shallows, they draw themselves up, hesitate, and then implode against the rocks with a force that seems to shake the entire peninsula. Air trapped inside their gray barrels gets blown out the back walls in geysers higher than the waves themselves. 30-foot seas are rolling in from the North Atlantic and attacking the town of Gloucester with a cold, heavy rage. By mid-afternoon, the wind is hitting hurricane force, and people are having a hard time walking, standing up, being heard. Moans emanate from the electric lines that only offshore fishermen have ever heard before. Waves inundate Good Harbor Beach and the parking lot in front of the Stop and Shop. They rip up entire sections of Atlantic Road. They deposit a 15-foot high tangle of lobster traps and sea muck at the end of Grapevine Road. They fill the swimming pool of a back-shore mansion with ocean bottom rubble. They suck beach cobbles up their huge faces and sling them inland, smashing windows, peppering lawns. They overturn the seawall at Brace Cove, spill into Niles Pond, and continue into the woods beyond. For a brief while, it's possible to surf across people's lawns. So much salt water gets pumped into Niles Pond that it overflows and cuts Eastern Point in half. Eastern Point is where the rich live, and by nightfall, the ocean is 2 feet deep in some of the nicest living rooms in the state. In several places around the state, houses float off their foundations and out to sea. Waves break through a 30-foot sand dune in Ballaston Beach in Truro and flood the headwaters of the Pamet River. 6,000-pound boat moorings drag inside the Chatham Harbor. The Pilgrim Nuclear Power Plant in New Hampshire shuts down because seaweed clogs the condenser intakes. A Delta Airlines pilot at Logan is surprised to see spray from breaking waves top the 200-foot cranes on Deer Island. Just sitting on the runway, his airspeed indicator clocks 80 miles an hour. Houses are washed out to sea in Gloucester, Swampscott, and on Cape Cod. Rising waters inundate half of the town of Nantucket. A man is swept off the rocks in Point Judith, Rhode Island, and is never seen again. And a surfer dies trying to ride 20-foot shore break in Massachusetts. Plum Island is cut in half by the waves, as is Hawes Neck in Squantum. In Quincy, over 100 houses are destroyed in the town of Scituate, and the National Guard has to be called out to help the inhabitants evacuate. One elderly woman is taken from her house by a backhoe while surf breaks down her front door. The winds have set so much water in motion that the ocean gets piled up against the continent and starts blocking the rivers. The Hudson backs up 100 miles to Albany and causes flooding, and the Potomac does the same. Tides are 5 feet above normal in Boston Harbor, within 1 inch of an all-time Boston record. Had the storm occurred a week earlier, during the highest tides of the month, water levels would be a foot and a half higher, flooding downtown Boston. Storms surge, and huge seas extinguished Isle of Shoals and Boone's Island lighthouses off the coast of Maine. Some Democrats are cheered to see waves obliterate the front of President Bush's summer mansion in Kennebunkport. Damage along the East Coast surpasses $1.5 billion, including millions of dollars in lobster ports and other fixed fishing gear. The only light I can shed on the severity of the storm is that until then, we had never, ever had a lobster trap move offshore, says Bob Brown. Some were moved 13 miles to the west. It was the worst storm I have ever heard of or experienced. By nightfall on the 31st, with wave heights at their peak and the East Coast bearing the full brunt of the storm, the Coast Guard finds itself with two major search and rescue operations on its hands. In Boston, a Coast Guardsman starts telephoning every harbor master in New England, asking if the Andrea Gale is in port. If the town is too small to have a harbor master, they ask a town selectman to walk down the waterfront and take a look. Coast Guard cutters also poke their way along the coast, checking every harbor and cove they can find. In Maine's Jonesport area, a cutter checks Sawyer's Cove, Rogue Harbor, Black Cove, Moose Peak Light, Chandler, and Englishman Bay. By Little Micah's Bay, Micah's Bay East Side, Micah's Bay West Side, and Mistaken Harbor, all without success. The entire coast from Lubec, Maine, to eastern Long Island is scrutinized, and without turning up any sign of the Andrea Gale. The search for Rick Smith is in some ways simpler than for the Andrea Gale, because the pilots know exactly where he went down. But a single human being, even with a strobe light, is extremely hard to spot in such conditions. One pilot missed a 500-foot freighter because it was obscured by waves during one leg of his stretch. As a result, the combined assets of half a dozen East Coast air bases are thrown into the search. Smith has a wife and 3 daughters at home, and he knows personally a significant proportion of the people who are looking for him. He's one of the most highly trained survival swimmers in the world, and if he hits the water alive, he'll probably stay that way. He might eventually die of thirst, but he's not going to drown. The first thing the Coast Guard does is drop a radio marker buoy where the other guardsmen were picked up. The buoy drifts the way a person would, and the search area shifts continually southwestward. Planes fly 30-mile track line searches 500 feet above the water. But in these conditions, the chances of spotting a man are only 1 in 3, so some areas get flown over again and again. There are so many planes in the air, and the search area is so limited that it's virtually certain they'll find him. And indeed, they find almost everything. They find the 9-man life raft pushed out of the helicopter by Jim Mioli. A guard diver is dropped from a helicopter to knife it so it won't throw off other searchers. They find the Avon raft abandoned by the Tamaroa, and rafts from other boats they didn't even know about. And then, just before dusk on the 31st, a Coast Guard plane spots a stain of day-glow green dye in the water. PJs are known to carry dye for just such emergencies, and this undoubtedly comes from Rick Smith. The pilot circles lower and sees a dark shape at the center, probably Rick Smith himself. The search plane crew drop a marker buoy, life raft, and flare kit, and the pilot radios the coordinates into Boston. A helicopter is diverted to the scene, and the cutter Tamaroa, 2.5 hours away, changes its course and starts heading for the spot. An H-60 launches from Elizabeth City, escorted by a tanker plane, and a Navy jet equipped with forward-looking infrared is ready for takeoff. If the rescuers can't get Smith by helicopter, they'll find him by ship. If they can't get him by ship, they'll drop a life raft. If he's too weak to get into the life raft, they'll drop a rescue swimmer. Smith is one of their own, and they're going to get him one way or another. It's full dark when the first helicopter zeroed in on the marker buoy and arrives on scene. There's no sign of Smith. The Coast Guard pilot who spotted him debriefed back on base, said the dye was fresh, and he was awful sure there was a man in the middle of it. The seas were too rough to tell. Whether he swam to the life raft that was dropped to him, though, Three hours later, one of the helicopter pilots radios that they spotted Smith near the radio marker buoy. Another H-60 and tanker plane prepare to launch from Suffolk, but no sooner are these orders given than the pilot on scene corrects himself. He didn't spot a person, he spotted a life raft. It was probably dropped by the Coast Guard earlier that day. The Suffolk aircraft stand down, though that night the storm slides south along the coast and then doubles back on itself, heading toward Nova Scotia and dissipating by the hour. The convective engine of the storm that sucks warm, moist air off the ocean is finally starting to break down in the cold northern weather. By the morning of November 1st, the conditions are stable enough to evacuate John Spillane, and he's strapped into a rescue litter and carried out of his room and on the aft deck of the Tamaroa. He's hoisted up into the belly of an H-3 and flown to Atlantic City, where he's rushed into intensive care and given 2 units of blood. A few hours later, a Coast Guardsman tracks down a search pilot who says he's dropped green dye into the water to mark a line he'd seen. That explains the dye, but not the person spotted at the center of it. A Coast Guard survival specialist named Mike Hyde said that Smith could stay warm virtually forever in quarter-inch wetsuit, but that he might drown by inhaling water into his lungs. There aren't any charts of graphs for survival time in the conditions he was in, Hyde says. If Smith made it through the storm, though, Hyde's personal guess is that he could survive another 4 days. Eventually he'd die of dehydration. The sea is much calmer now, but the search has been going full bore for 72 hours without turning up anything. Chances are almost non-existent that Smith is alive. On the morning of November 2nd, the storm now over, Prince Edward Island and failing fast, the cutter Tamaroa makes port at Shinnecock Inlet, Long Island, and Rivola, Bashore, and Meoli are taken off by motor launch. Rick Smith's wife, Mary Ann, is at Suffolk Air Base for the event, and several people express concern over her watching the airmen reunited with their families. What do they think? That I want those women to lose their husbands too? She wonders. She takes John Brem, the PJ supervisor, aside and says, "Look, John, if they haven't found Rick by now, they're not going to. As far as I'm concerned, I'm a widow, and I need to know what's going to happen." Brem expresses the hope that they might still find him, but Marianne just shakes her head. "If he were alive, he'd signal," she says. "He's not alive." Marianne Smith, who's nursing a 3-week-old baby, practically hasn't slept since the ditching. She found out about it late the first night, when someone from the airbase called and woke her up out of an exhausted sleep. It took her a minute to even understand what the person was saying, and when she did, he reassured her that it was controlled ditching and everything would be fine. Things were not fine, though. First, they wouldn't tell her which four crew members had been picked up by the Tamaroa. She understandably assumed that one of them was her husband. And then they said they'd spotted him at the center of some green dye, and then they'd lost him again. Now she's between worlds, treated as a widow by everyone on base, but still reassured that her husband will be found alive. No one, it seems, can openly face the fact that Rick Smith is dead. The planes keep going out. The grids keep getting flown. Finally, after 9 days of round-the-clock flights, the Coast Guard suspends its search for Rick Smith. The consensus is that he must have hit the water so hard that he was knocked unconscious and drowned. Another possibility is that Spillane hit him when he landed, or that the life raft hit him, or that he jumped with his gunner strap on. The gunner strap is used to keep crewmen from falling out of helicopters, and if Smith jumped with it on, he'd have just dangled below the helicopter until Revolva set it down. John Spillane prefers to believe that Smith was knocked out on impact. He was weighed down by a lot of gear, and he must have lost position during his fall and hit the water flat. Spillane's only memory of the fall is exactly that, starting to flail, thinking, "My God, what a long way down." Those words, or something very like them, are probably the last thoughts that went through Rick Smith's mind. While aircraft are crisscrossing the waters of the coast of Maryland, an even larger search continues for the Andrea Gale. 15 aircraft, including Navy P-3 transferred from the Smith search, are flying grids southwest of Sable Island, where a life raft would most likely have drifted. A rumor ripples through the Gloucester area that Billy Tyne called somewhere on a satellite phone the night of the 29th, but Bob Brown chases the rumor down and tells the Coast Guard it's bogus. Half the boats in the Sword Fleet, the Lorry Dawn 8, Mr. Simon, Mary T., and the Anchin Maru sustained considerable damage and cut their trips short. The eastern half of the fleet misses the full fury of the storm. "Oh, we only had about 70-knot winds," Linda Greenlaw recalls. "But such extreme weather generally ruins the fishing for days, and most of the eastern boats head in as well." Nothing is seen or heard of the Andrea Gale until November 1st, when Albert Johnston, streaming for home, plows straight through a cluster of blue fuel barrels. They're 100 miles southwest of Sable, and they all have AG stenciled on the side. The barrels went down either side of the hull. "I didn't even have the chance to change course," said Johnston. "It was spooky, you know. Just a few barrels. That was all that was left." An hour later, Johnston passes another cluster, and then a third, and calls their position in to the Coast Guard. The barrels don't by themselves mean the Andrea Gale went down. They could have just washed off deck, but they're not a good sign. The Canadian and American Coast Guards keep widening the search, and without finding anything, finally on November 4th, things start to turn up. A Coast Guardsman on a routine beach patrol south around Sable Island finds a propane tank and radio beacon with Andrea Gale printed on them. The beacon is for locating fishing gear and has been switched on, which may have been a desperate attempt to surround the stricken boat with as many electronically active objects as possible. Normally they're stowed in the off position, and then on the afternoon of November 5th, an EPIRB washes up on Sable Island. It's an orange 406 megahertz model built by an American company named Coden, and the ring switch has been turned off. That means that it can't signal even if it hits the water. The serial number is 986. It's from the Andrea Gale. Like the bottled note thrown overboard from the schooner Falcon a century ago, the odds of something as small as an EPIRB winding up in human hands are absurdly small, and the odds of Billy Tyne disarming his EPIRB. There's no reason to. It wouldn't even save batteries, are even smaller. Bob Brown, Linda Greenlaw, Charlie Reed, no one who knows Billy can explain it. The 14-page incident log kept by the Canadian Coast Guard records the discovery of the propane tank and the radio beacon, but not of the EPIRB. The entire day, in fact, that the EPIRB is found, November 5th, 1991, is missing from the log. Rumors start creeping around Gloucester that the Coast Guard did pick up an EPIRB signal when the Andrea Gale was in trouble, but conditions were too severe to go out. And when, against all odds, the EPIRB washes up on Sable Island, the Coast Guard switches it off to cover themselves. Whether the rumors are fair or not, they're in some ways beside the point. Conditions severe enough to frighten the Coast Guard are severe enough to prevent a rescue. By that time, the EPIRB started signaling, if it ever did. The crew of the Andrea Gale were probably doomed anyway. Judging by the rescue attempts off Long Island, even a helicopter hovering directly over the Andrea Gale crew would have been powerless to help them. Regardless, the EPIRB is duly transported back to the United States for inspection by the Federal Communications Commission. On November 6th, a Canadian pilot spots an uninflated life raft just off Nova Scotia coast, but there's no one inside it, and he loses sight of it before it can be recovered. 2 days later, the Hannah Boden, streaming home after 3 weeks at sea, spots another cluster of fuel barrels marked AG on the side, but there's still no sign of the boat. Finally, half an hour before midnight, on November 8th, the search for the Andrea Gale is permanently suspended. She's been missing almost 2 weeks, and planes have searched 116,000 square miles of ocean without finding any survivors. All they turned up was a little deck gear. I went down to the fish pier a lot after the search ended, says Chris Cotter. I went there alone, and I'd go through these things, picturing what happened to their bodies. That kind of horror. I'd reject it from my mind and my soul as soon as it blew in, and then I'd remember the good things. He'd come back to me, and it would all be okay. I'd miss him immensely, though. I'd fight it all the time. Later, I'd tell myself, I'll see him later on. The memorial service is held several days after St. several days later at St. Anne's Church, just up the hill from the Crow's Nest. It's the first service in 13 years for Gloucestermen lost at sea, and it brings people out who don't even know the men who died. The sea was their domain. They knew it well, Reverend Casey says quietly to the 1,000 people packed into his church for the service. I urge you to mourn not just for these 3 men, but for all the other brave people who gave their lives for Gloucester and its fishing industry. Mary Ann and Rusty Shatford read a poem about fishing, and Sully's brother speaks, and some of the Tyne family speak. Bob and Susan Brown are at the service, but they say very little and leave as soon as it's over. This is the 3rd time men have died on one of Bob Brown's boats, and regardless of fault, people in town are not inclined to forget it. After the service, the mourners drive and walk down the steep hill to Roger Street and pile into the Crow's Nest and the Irish Mariner, where a wake is held for the next couple of days. Food is brought and people go to Sully's brother's apartment, then back to the Crow's Nest, then over to the Tynes, and then back to the nest again, endlessly all weekend long. If the men on the Andrea Gale had simply died, and their bodies were lying in state somewhere, their loved ones could make their goodbyes and get on with their lives. But they didn't die. They disappeared off the face of the earth. And strictly speaking, it's just a matter of faith that these men will never return. Such faith takes work. It takes effort. The people of Gloucester must willfully extract these men from their lives and banish them to another world. The night before I found out about the boat, I had this dream, says Deborah Murphy, Murph's ex-wife. Murph was supposed to be home for my birthday, and in my dream, I don't know if he's standing there or if he's calling me. He says, I'm sorry I'm not going to make it this time. Then I wake up, and the phone call comes. It's from Billy's new girlfriend, who says there was a big storm out there, and the Andrea Gale hasn't been heard from in a couple of days. The first thing Deborah does is drive over to Murph's parents' house to give them the bad news. They've never liked his fishing much. His father's in real estate. They live a quiet suburban life and sit there in shock while Deborah tells them the boat is missing. She doesn't know much more than that. One fact, and when she calls Bob Brown, all he can tell her is that the boat was last heard from on the 28th, and that a search has been launched. Brown refuses to return her calls. After that, so she starts talking to the Coast Guard every day, asking how many flights went out, whether they see anything, what they plan to do next. Finally, after 10 days of hell, Deborah sits her 3-year-old son, Dale Jr., down and explains that his father's not coming back. Her son doesn't understand and wants to know where he is. He's fishing, honey, she answers. He's fishing in heaven. Dale knows his father fishes lots of places. Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Massachusetts. Heaven must be just another place where his father fishes. Well, when's he coming back from fishing in heaven, he asks. A couple of months later, as far as young Dale is concerned, his father does come back from fishing in heaven. Dale wakes up screaming in the middle of the night, and Deborah rushes to his room panicked. What's wrong, honey? What's wrong? She says. Daddy's in the room, Dale answers. Daddy was just here. What do you mean? Daddy was just here, Deborah asks. Daddy was here and told me what happened on the boat. 3-year-old Dale, stumbling over the language, goes on to repeat what his father told him. The boat rolled over and caught his father on a hook, one of the gaff hooks for grabbing fish. The hook snagged his shirt, and Murph wasn't able to free himself in time. He got dragged under, and that was it. My son has a lot of anger in him from losing his father, says Deborah. There'll be days where he'll just be really depressed, and I'll say, What's the matter, Dale? And he'll say, Nothing. Mom, I'm just thinking about Dad. Oh, God, he'll look at me with these big brown eyes, the tears running down his cheeks, and it kills me because there's nothing I can do, not one thing. Others, too, are visited. Murph's mother looks out the bedroom window one day and sees Murph ambling down their street in huge deck boots. Someone else spots him in traffic in downtown Bradenton. From time to time, Deborah dreams that she sees him and runs up and says, Dale, where have you been? And he won't answer. She'll wake up in a cold sweat, remembering. Back in Gloucester, Chris Cotter has a similar dream. Bobby appears before her, all smiles, and she says to him, "Hey, Bobby, where have you been?" He doesn't tell her. He just keeps smiling and says, "Remember, Christina, I'll always love you." And then he fades away. He's always happy when he goes, and so I know he's okay, says Chris. He's absolutely okay. Chris, however, is not okay. Some nights she finds herself down at the State Fish Pier, waiting for the Andrea Gale to come in. Other times she tells her friends, "Bobby's coming home tonight, I know it." She dates other men, she continues with her life, but she cannot accept that he is gone. They never find a body, they never find a piece of the boat, and she holds on to these things as proof that maybe the whole crew is safe on an island somewhere, drinking margaritas and watching the sun go down. Once Chris dreams that Bobby is living below the sea with a beautiful blonde woman. The woman is a mermaid, and Bobby's with her now. Chris wakes up and heads back to the crow's nest. Within weeks of the tragedy, families of the dead men get a letter from Bob Brown asking them to exonerate him from responsibility. The letter is polite and to the point, saying that the Andrea Gale was tight, strong, fully manned, equipped and supplied, and in all respects seaworthy and fit for service, in which she was enraged. Unfortunately, she was also overwhelmed by the sea. For several of the bereaved, Jody Tyne, Deborah Murphy, this is the only letter they get from Bob Brown. He doesn't write a sympathy card. He doesn't offer financial help. He just sends a letter protecting himself from full future legalities. It's possible that he's too shy or embarrassed to deal intimately with the bereaved, but they don't see it that way. They see Bob Suicide Brown as a businessman who has made hundreds of thousands of dollars off men like their husbands. To a woman, they decide to sue. The deaths of the 6 Andrea Gale crew fall under the Death on the High Seas Act, a law passed by Congress in the early 1970s, and then amended by the Supreme Court in 1990. A suit involving wrongful death on the high seas is limited to pecuniary loss, meaning the amount of money the deceased was earning for his dependents. Bobby Shatford, example, was paying $325 a month in child support. Under the High Seas Act, his ex-wife could and does sue Bob Brown for that money, but Ethel Shatford cannot sue. She has lost a son, not a legal provider, and has suffered no pecuniary loss. The High Seas Act is a vestige of the hard-nosed English common law, which saw death at sea as an act of God that ship owners couldn't possibly be held liable for. Where would it end? How could they possibly do business? Had these men died in a logging accident, say, the family members could sue their employer for the loss of a loved one, but not on the high seas. On the high seas, defined as more than a marine league or 3 miles from shore, anything goes. The only way for Ethel Shatford to be compensated for the loss of her son would be to prove that Bobby's death had been exceptionally agonizing, or that Bob Brown had been negligent in his upkeep of the boat. Suffering, of course, is impossible to prove on a boat that disappears without a trace, but negligence is not. Negligence can be proven through repair records, expert witnesses, and the testimony of former crew. Several weeks after the loss of the Andrea Gale, a Boston attorney named Dave Ansell agreed to represent the estates of Murphy, Moran, and Pierre in a wrongful death suit against Bob Brown. The other cases, including a wrongful death suit filed by Ethel Shatford, are handled by a Boston attorney who also specializes in maritime law. Brown's name is already known to Ansell. 10 years earlier, Ansell's law firm represented the widow of the man washed out of the sea fever on Georgia's bank. Now Ansell has to prove Brown negligent once again. The fact that Brown acted like every other boat owner since the Sword Fleet, eyeballing structural changes, overloading the whaleback, failing to carry out stability tests, isn't necessarily enough to clinch the case. Ansell packs his bags and heads to St. Augustine, Florida, where 5 years earlier Bob Brown altered the lines of the Andrea Gale. The shipyard, St. Augustine Trawlers, has been closed and sold by the IRS, but Ansell tracks down a former manager named Don Capo and asks him to give a deposition. Capo agrees. In the presence of a notary public and Bob Brown's attorney, Dave Ansell questions Capo about the alterations to the Andrea Gale. To your knowledge, sir, Was there a marine architect on board the vessel in Mr. Brown's employ? I don't recall any. Well, there are. Were there any measurements or tests or evaluations done to determine the amount of weight being added to the vessel? No, sir. Were there stability tests performed, either hydraulic or reclining? No, sir. So far, Capo's testimony has been damning. Brown altered the vessel without consulting a marine architect, and then launched her without a single stability test. To anyone but a sword fisherman or a marine welder, this would seem unusual, negligent, in fact, but it's not. In the fishing industry, it's as common as drunks in bars. How would you characterize the Andrea Gale compared to other vessels? Ansel finally asks, hoping to put the last nail in the coffin. Capo doesn't hesitate. Oh, top of the line. Ansel's line of attack has been blunted, but he has other avenues. For starters, he can talk to Doug Costco, who walked off the boat with 6 hours to go because he got a bad feeling. What did Costco know? Had anything happened on the previous trip? Costco works for the A.P. Bell Fish Company in Cortez, Florida, and when he's not at sea, he's usually crashing at one of his friend's apartment or another. He's a hard man to find. It's, how can I put it, a nomadic existence, says Ansel. These guys don't come home for dinner at 5 o'clock. They're gone 3 or 4 months at a time. Ansel finally tracks Costco down to his parents' house in Bradenton, but Costco is uncooperative to the point of belligerence. He says that when he heard about the Andrea Gale, he went into a 3-month depression that cost him his job and nearly put him in the hospital. At one point, Dale Murphy's parents invited him over to dinner, but he couldn't deal with it. He never went. He'd known Murph as well as Bugsy and Billy, and all he could think of was, that was supposed to have been me. Had Costco gone on the trip, it's possible that he would have spent his last few moments pleading for his life, for this life, the one he's now leading. His wish was granted, in a sense, and it destroys him. Ansel's case is fraying at the edges. He can't use Costco's testimony because the man's too much of a mess. The Coast Guard says the EPIRB tested perfectly, although they won't release the report, and there's no hard evidence that the Andrea Gale was unstable. By the standards of the industry, she was a seaworthy boat, fit for the task, and sank due to an act of God rather than any negligence on Bob Brown's part. The alterations to her hull may have helped her roll over, but they didn't cause it. She rolled over because she was in the middle of a storm. She was in the middle of the storm of the century, and no judge is going to see it otherwise. Ansel's clients know that and decide to settle out of court. They probably won't get much, 80 or 90,000. They won't run the risk of having Bob Brown completely exonerated. Ansel starts negotiating a settlement, and the other suits are also settled in private. The relative stability of the Andrea Gale will never be debated in court. About a year after the boat goes down, a man who looks exactly like Bobby Shatford walks into the Crow's Nest and orders a beer. The entire lineup of regulars at the bar top turn and stare. One of the bartenders is too shocked to speak. Ethel, who's just gotten off her shift, has seen the man before in town, and explains to him why everyone's staring. You look just like my son who died last year, she says. There's a photo of him on that wall. The man goes over and studies it. The photo shows Bobby in a t-shirt, hat, and sunglasses down on the fisherman's wharf. His arms are folded. He's leaning a little to one side and smiling at the camera. It was taken on a day that he was walking around town with Chris, and he looks very happy. 3 months later, he'd be dead. Jesus, if I sent this photo home to my mother, she'd think it was me, the man says. She'd never know the difference. Luckily, the man is a carpenter, not a fisherman. If he were a fisherman, he'd drain his beer and settle onto his bar stool and think things over a bit. People who work on boats have a hard time resisting the idea that certain ones among them are marked, that they will be reclaimed by the sea. The spitting image of a man who drowned is a good candidate for that, and so are all his shipmates. Jonah, of course, was marked, and his shipmates knew it. Murph was marked and told his mother so. Adam Randall was marked, but had no idea. As far as he was concerned, he just had a couple of close calls. After the Andrea Gale went down, he told his girlfriend, Chris Hansen, that while he was walking around on board, he felt a cold wind on his skin and realized that no one on the crew was coming back. He didn't say anything to them, though, because on the waterfront that isn't done. You just don't tell 6 men you think they're going to drown. Everyone takes their chances, and either you drown or you don't. And then there are the nearly dead. Costco, Hazard, Reeves. These people are leading lives that, but for the merest of circumstances, should have already ended. Anyone who has been through a severe storm at sea has, to one degree or another, almost died, and that fact will continue to alter them long after the winds have stopped blowing and the waves have died down. Like a war or a great fire, the effects of a storm go rippling outward through the webs of people for years, even generations. It breaches like coastlines, and nothing is ever the same. My boss took me to the hotel, and the first thing I did was have 3 shots of vodka straight up, says Judith Reeves, after she got off the Engine Maru 78 in Halifax on October 31st. The engineer had rigged up some cables in the hold that manually turned the rudder. The captain shouted commands down to him from the bridge. He pulled the cables, and that was how they weathered the storm. I called my mom and then my roommate, and I didn't sleep that whole first night because the hotel room wasn't rocking. Next morning, I did, midday, the CBS news show here, and then I went to the CBC studios for another interview, and that was the first time that I got scared. I started smoking and drinking, and by the time I went to the third interview, I was quite hammered. They wanted to do it live, and I said, "Are you sure about that?" I was in such demand by the media for 2 or 3 weeks. I mean, the whole country was praying for me. It was kind of a high. But then I went home in December to see my mom and dad, and as soon as I got back here, I fell into a depression. I lost a lot of weight and started going on these long crying jags. You can only sustain that high level for so long before you break down. You finally become an ordinary person again. Reeves keeps working as a fisheries observer and eventually meets and marries a Russian fisherman from one of her boats. Karen Stimson, who also spent several days at sea thinking she was going to die, breaks down more quickly than Reeves, but not as badly. After the rescue, she stays at a friend's apartment in Boston, avoiding reporters, and the next day, she decides to go out and get a cappuccino. She walks into a cafe around the corner, orders, and then pulls a roll of bills out of her pocket to pay. The bills are wet with seawater. The man at the cash register looks from her face to the wet bills, to her face again, and says, "I know you. You're the woman that they saved off the boat." Stimson is horrified. She pushes the money at him, but just waves her away. No, it's on us. Just thank God you're alive. Thank God you're alive." She hadn't thought about it like that, but yes, she could well be swirling around in the freezing black depths of the George right now. She grabs her coffee and runs out the door sobbing. 2 weeks after the search for Rick Smith has been called off, Marianne gets a telephone call from a man named John Monty of West Hampton Beach, Long Island, who says that he's a psychic and that Rick Smith is still alive. He tells her that he's talked to Suffolk Air Base and that they want to resume searching for him. Marianne's heart sinks. It's taking her 2 weeks to accept the fact that her husband is dead, and now she's supposed to start hoping all over again? There's no way Rick could still be alive, but she's afraid of what people might think if she discourages a search, so she gives her okay. The PJs at the base are worried about the same thing, what Marianne will think, so they give her their okay as well. Monty gets a local lawyer named John Giras interested in the case. Giras drafts a letter to the New York State Representative George Hockenbucker demanding that the search be resumed. Hockenbucker passes the letter along to Admiral Bill Keim, Commandant of the U.S. Coast Guard, and the case filters through a command structure back to D1 ComCen in Boston. A response is drawn up and explaining how thorough the search was, and unlikely it would be that a man could survive 26 days at sea, and that is sent back up the ladder to Keim. Meanwhile, Monty gives Marianne a list of press contacts to call to publicize the case and himself. "It's the only time in my life I thought I was going crazy," she says. "I finally told him to get lost. I couldn't take it anymore." After a month, Marianne Smith is able to start absorbing the loss of her husband. As long as the planes are going out, she holds on to some shred of hope, and that keeps her in a ghastly kind of limbo. Several weeks after Rick's death, she dreams that he comes up to her with a sad look on his face and says, "I'm sorry," and then gives her a hug. It's the only dream she ever has of him, and it constitutes a goodbye of sorts. Marianne takes her children to a memorial service in Rick's hometown in Pennsylvania, but not to the one on Long Island, because she knows there are going to be a lot of television cameras there. Children don't grieve in front of crowds. They grieve in bed, saying, "I want Daddy to read me a book," she says. George Bush sends her a letter of sympathy, as does Governor Mario Cuomo. Marianne discovers that as a widow, she makes people extremely uncomfortable. Either they avoid her or treat her like a cripple. Marianne Smith, who started out as an avionics technician for an F-16 squadron, decides to face her widowhood by going to law school and becoming a lawyer. John Spillane gets a job as a New York City fireman. In addition to his PJ status, one night he's half awakened by the station alarm, and for some reason, the room lights don't go on. He's terrified. He finds himself by the exit pole thinking, "It's okay. You've been through this before. Just keep your head." All he knows is that it's dark. There's not much time, and he's got to go downward. Exactly the same situation in the helicopter. By the time he finally understands where he is, he's put on his firefighting clothes. He's fully cocked and ready to go. The storm hasn't finished with people. Though. Hasn't stopped reverberating through people's lives. 18 months after the ditchings, a nor'easter roars up the coast that, even before it's fully formed, meteorologists are referring to it as the mother of all storms. It has a distinct eye, just like a hurricane, and a desperately low central barometric pressure. One ship in its path watches wave heights jump from 30 feet to 20 feet in less than 2 hours. The storm drops 50 inches of snow on the mountains of North Carolina and sets all-time barometric records from Delaware to Boston. Winds hit 110 miles an hour in the Gulf of Mexico, and the Coast Guard rescues 235 people off boats during the first 2 days alone. Wave heights surpass 60 feet off much of the East Coast and creep up toward 100 feet of Nova Scotia. Data buoys record significant wave heights, the average top third, only a few feet lower than the storm that sank the Andrea Gale. By the narrowest of margins, the Halloween Gale, as that storm has come to be known, remains the record for most powerful nor'easter of the century. Caught in the worst of this is the 584-foot Gold Bond conveyor, the freighter that 2 years earlier had relayed Satori's Mayday to Boston. The Gold Bond conveyor has regular run between Halifax and Tampa, carrying gypsum ore, and on March 14th, about 100 miles southeast of where Billy Tyne went down, she runs into the mother of all storms. She's the only vessel of any kind to encounter both storms at their height, and they happen to be two of the most powerful nor'easters of the century. One could say the vessel was marked. That evening, the captain radios Halifax that the waves are breaking over their upper decks, and shortly after midnight, he calls again to say that they're abandoning ship. The seas are 100 feet, and the snow is driving down sideways in the dark. 33 men go over the side and are never seen again. But it's still not over. The Halloween Gale has one last shoulder to tap. Adam Randall has been working steadily on the Mary T, but in February, Albert Johnston hauls her out for repairs, and Randall has to find another job. He finds one on the Terry Lay, a tuna longliner out of Georgetown, South Carolina. The Terry Lay is a big, heavily built boat with a highly experienced crew, and she's due to go out at the end of March. Chris Hansen, Randall's girlfriend, drives him to Longin Airport for the flight south, but all the planes are grounded because of the blizzard, the mother of all storms. He gets a flight out the next day, but when he talks with Chris Hansen on the phone from South Carolina, she tells him she's worried about him. "Are you okay? There's a funny sound in your voice," she says. "Yeah, I'm fine," he says. "I don't really want to go on this trip. It'll be good, though. Maybe I'll make some money." The night before leaving, the crew of the Terry Lay go to a local bar and get into a fight with the crew of another boat. Several men wind up in the hospital, but the next day, bruised and sore, the crew of the Terry Lay cut their lines and head out to sea. They're going to work the deep waters just off the continental shelf. due east of Charleston. It's spring, the fish are working their way up the Gulf Stream, and with a little luck, they'll make their trip in 10 or 12 sets. On the night of April 6th, they finish setting their gear, and then Randall calls Chris Hansen on the ship-to-shore radio. They talk for over an hour. Ship-to-shore isn't cheap. Randall's phone bill is regularly $500, and he tells Chris that they'd had some bad weather, but it's past and all their gear is in the water. He says he'll call her soon. Randall's a tough one to categorize. He's an expert fisherman and marine welder, but has also, at various times, considered hairdressing or nursing careers. He has a tattoo of a clipper ship on one arm and an anchor on the other, and a scar on his hand where he once stitched himself up with a needle and thread. He has the sort of long blonde hair that one associates with English rock stars, but he also has the muscle build of a man who works hard. You can hit him with a hammer, and he won't bruise, Chris Hansen says. Randall says that at times he can feel ghosts swirling around the boat, the ghosts of men who died at sea. They're not at peace. They want back in. The next morning, the crew of the Terry Lay start hauling their gear in choppy seas and gusty winds. They're 135 miles offshore, and there are a lot of boats in the area, including a freighter en route from South America to Delaware. At 8:45 a.m., the Charleston Coast Guard pick up an EPIRB distress signal, and they immediately send out 2 aircraft and a cutter to investigate. It might be a false alarm. The weather is moderate, and no ships have reported trouble, but they have responded anyway. They home in on the radio signal and immediately spot the EPIRB amid a scattering of deck gear. A short distance away floats a life raft with the canopy up, and Terry Lay stenciled on the side. The boat herself has vanished, and no one signals from the raft, so a swimmer drops into the water to investigate. He strokes over and hauls himself up on one of the grab lines. The raft is empty. No one got off the Terry Lay alive. Acknowledgements. One of the most difficult tasks in writing this book was to get to know, to whatever extent this is possible, the men who died at sea in the Halloween gale. That required contacting their friends and family and reopening wounds that had only begun to heal. With that in mind, I would like to thank the Shatford family, Chris Cotter, Tammy Cabral, Deborah Murphy, Mildred Murphy, Jody Tyne, Chris Hansen, and Marianne Smith for their willingness to talk about such a painful episode in their lives. The survivors of the storm also had difficult stories to tell, and I am indebted to Judith Reeves, Karen Stimson, John Spillane, and Dave Rivola for talking about their experiences so openly. I would also like to thank all the people who answered my questions about fishing, brought me beers at the Crow's Nest, got me into fishing boats, and generally taught me about the sea. They are, in no particular order, Linda Greenlaw, Albert Johnston, Charlie Reed, Tommy Berry, Alex Bueno, John Davis, Chris Rooney, Hard Millard, Mike Sakarikia, Sasquatch, Tony Jacket, and Charlie Johnson. In addition, Bobby Brown was kind enough to talk to me despite the obvious delicate issues surrounding the loss of his boat. This material first appeared as an article in Outside Magazine, and I must thank the editors there for their help. Also Howie Sanders and Richard Green in Los Angeles. Finally, I must thank my friends and family for reading draft after draft of this manuscript, as well as my editor, Starling Lawrence, his assistant, Patricia Choi, and my agent, Stuart Krivishensky. The end. And now, folks, I'm going to bed.